Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Racial Justice Learning Series. We're all so glad you're here. My name is Molly Blau-Gillis, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a partner at General Catalyst. Last year, GC launched this learning series with renowned leaders to foster conversation, collective learning, and action related to racial justice and equity. Today, we are thrilled to continue our discussions focused on the Asian American Pacific Islander experience, with a conversation focused on the future of AAPIs in tech, investing, and media. Today's discussion marks the last chapter in this year's series. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the themes of solidarity, resistance, and hope within our Asian American Pacific Islander history. And we are so grateful for the incredible leaders and lifelong learners who have shared their knowledge, experience, activism, and inspiration with all of us. For additional upcoming events and updates, please follow GC on social media. A few housekeeping reminders. This session is being recorded. Closed captioning as well as a live transcript are available for internal and educational purposes for those who are interested. And a reminder to please feel free to ask questions via the Q&A function. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Stephanie Morimoto is the owner and CEO of Asutra, a holistic self-care brand offering organic natural remedies for pain relief, sleep, and rejuvenation. Stephanie is a board member of Equality Illinois, which advocates for LGBTQ rights, Naturally Chicago, which creates an ecosystem for natural product companies to thrive, and Global Cosmetic Industry, which delivers forward-thinking insights for product and brand innovation. She was named the Beacon Award Entrepreneur of the Year in 2021. Bing Chen is chairman and co-founder of Gold House, a collective of pioneering founders, creative voices, and leaders dedicated to accelerating the Asian diaspora's societal impact and enhancing the community's cultural legacy. Bing is also the executive chairman, CEO, and founder of AU Holdings, investing in multicultural creators, companies, and communities to rebalance socioeconomic equity. Chieh Huang is co-founder and CEO of Boxed, a warehouse club delivery service. Previously, Chieh was the co-founder of mobile gaming company AstroApe, which was acquired by Zynga. Chieh is an innovator and philanthropist named to Bloomberg Businessweek's 50 People to Watch and Entrepreneur Magazine's list of the 50 most daring entrepreneurs. And I am so pleased to introduce my colleague at General Catalyst, Paul Kwan. Paul is a managing director at GC, investing in software and internet companies. Prior to joining GC, Paul was head of West Coast technology banking at Morgan Stanley, where he led IPOs and M&A for leading technology companies globally. Finally, our fantastic moderator for today's conversation is my friend Stephanie Mehta, CEO and Chief Content Officer of Mansueto Ventures, the business media company that publishes Fast Company and Inc. She previously spent nearly 4 years as editor-in-chief of Fast Company, overseeing its print, digital, and live journalism. Prior to that, Stephanie held senior writing and editing positions at Fortune, Bloomberg Media, and Vanity Fair. She serves on the boards of the Women's Forum of New York, the American Society of Magazine Editors, and Arabelle Impact Lab, the research and innovation arm of the International Rescue Committee. Please join me in warmly welcoming our panel. Thank you all for being here with us today to share your insights and perspectives. Over to you, Stephanie.
Great. Thank you, Molly. And thank you to all of the panelists and to General Catalyst for putting this together. It's going to be an exciting hour. And just want to echo what Molly said about dropping your questions in the chat. We want this to be a really robust conversation. And so there will be time at the end for Q&A, but if you have a thought or something you want to throw to one of the panelists, we'll be on the lookout. So I want to dive right in, and hopefully Chieh will be able to join us. I know he's on the road and probably trying to find his way to a computer. Before we can talk about the future of Asian American Pacific Islanders in tech, media, and investing, I think it's really important to set the stage by talking about where we are today. And the good news is that there are a lot of data. There's a lot of research being done about the AAPI experience in the workplace, in leadership, and in media. The bad news is that the numbers aren't always that great. Asian Americans represent about 7.3% of the US population, or people who identify as Asian American represent a little more than 7%. And while we are holding our own in terms of representation in the workplace, and we even over-index in some industries such as technology, we lag our white counterparts when it comes to promotions at the highest levels, and representation in film is woefully underperforming. So I want to talk to all of the panelists about, sort of where we are today, so we can level set about how we achieve a better future. Stephanie, I'm going to start with you. Congratulations on your Beacon Award. Tell us a little bit about your experiences as a woman and as an Asian American trying to build a business.
Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to see this virtual room, if you will, given that we're talking about what it's like to be Asian American Pacific Islander in the various industries we're in. So just thank you to General Catalyst and you, Stephanie, and all the panelists for sharing your experiences today. For me, a couple things about my background as context in answer to that question. One of the things we talk about with regards to Asian America, if you will, today is that we're not a monolith. It's so many different ethnicities, cultures, languages, and that is my life, right? So background-wise, I am Japanese American, Chinese American, Indonesian American, and have always, honestly, growing up in the Midwest, kind of struggled to feel like I belonged. When I went to college, there was the Chinese American Association or the Korean American Association, but there wasn't anything for somebody like me who had so many different ethnic aspects to my background. And getting to own and build a sutra has been the positive culmination of so many experiences. What I did discover in college was, even though there wasn't an Asian American group that I could feel a real part of, where I did feel like I belonged was building a really diverse group of friends at Brown, from the standpoint of race and ethnicity, sexuality, geography, interests. And that's what we get to do at a Sutra, right? Our mission is to help our customers take care of themselves well so they can be their best in life and support their communities. And from a workplace culture standpoint, I now get to build the workplace culture of belonging and bringing 100% of yourself to work that I think I always craved. And we get to do that for our customers too. And the last thing I'll just say is that, being a woman of color, so many of our customers are as well. So being a woman, being an Asian American woman, knowing what it's like to struggle with burnout and lack of sleep and trying to get well and get better is actually an asset, because I can understand what our customers need and want, and we can better serve them through our products and education.
We've read so much about the challenges that women in particular face when it comes to raising money, when working with vendors, with just, sort of trying to have an even playing field when negotiating. Again, in the early days of the business, as you were getting started, did you feel like there were biases you experienced as you tried to build a sutra?
I think I was lucky in that regard. We have not raised outside capital. We've actually been able to bootstrap everything, which has also been a blessing in a lot of ways, to both have the resources as well as the control over how we implement our mission every day. Again, I think for me, it was more about working in places like McKinsey or public education reform, where I didn't feel like I necessarily had that support, or I did face those biases about my leadership or my abilities. And, frankly, one of the things I decided to do was build and run a company as CEO so that I could create a different environment for everybody who works for me, and also for myself.
Yeah, it's a great case study in entrepreneurship as an empowerment tool. Paul, I'm going to turn to you a little bit, because the research shows that when it comes to representation and advancing, Asian Americans are really keeping pace in the world of investing, more than keeping pace. A lot of the recent human capital surveys around investing show that Asian American venture investing professionals in particular, the numbers are strong and growing. What is the investing community doing right in terms of attracting and retaining Asian Americans?
Yeah, I mean, I think the numbers, as you talk about, are certainly up. I think there's been a lot of progress. I think awareness and recruiting there has been good. I think some of that, may frankly be a function of, where people hire from. If you look at, graduates of MBA programs, these top schools, some of these companies, it may be a function of that. And so I do think there's a lot of progress there. I do want to echo something, Stephanie said around the diversity of the Asian American population. It's almost like you have to look country by country. And then within each country, you have very different journeys, right? Economically, culturally, education background wise for those different constituents, right? And so that's one thing I know we've talked about some previous seminars. The actual Asian American journey is a very diverse one. You have to understand those different countries, and then within those countries, the socioeconomic paths there. I stepping back, 25 years ago when I started on Wall Street and, was working with tech VCs, at one point, kind of like in the 2000s, we wanted to have like a little Asian American AAPI business club. And literally, the list of names was like one page. Bing will talk about his efforts. Like we had 1 page of names back then, like circa 2000 for Asian American leaders in business. So we've come a long way. I worked, on probably 200 transactions in 25 years on Wall Street. And there were probably 4 or 5, East Asian CEOs I got to interact with in 25 years, one of which was Chieh, right? So again, I think we've come a long way there, but there's a lot more to do when you talk about representation at the senior most levels, at the leadership levels, vis-a-vis relative to the population of the workers within that. So yeah, I think we made progress. I think we've come a long way, but a long way to go as well.
Yeah. Bing, I want to talk about, all of your portfolio, but, one of the things that you're particularly well known for is the Gold House list. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about helping us level set and why representation is so important, particularly in the media. There's a lot of statistics that show that there continue to be stereotypes of the portrayal of Asian Americans in films. The numbers of Asian Americans in leading or heroic roles far underperforms or under indexes what we see in other ethnicities. I know we're supposed to be talking about tech and the professional world, but why is representation in media so important?
Absolutely. And I should also remark that, as you know better than anyone, Stephanie, leadership behind the camera and or in its corner offices is equally, if not more important, which you obviously have very successfully sort of broken the glass ceiling there. So thank you for that. And also, of course, thank you to GC, Paul, and Molly for having us. I would say media, as we all know, is more than just sort of theaters, popcorn, delight, and clicks. It's about establishing new facts, ultimately. Let me just sort of illustrate through 3 different examples. One is media sort of imagines and redefines lexicon, as well as the connotation of that lexicon that has very practical outcomes. The example that always persists in my mind is I distinctly remember more than a decade ago, the year that NBC became the first TV network to ban the term alien when describing undocumented immigrants, which of course directly coincided with sweeping beneficial policies, including DACA. So a very practical output of changing even just 2 words in that case. Second is, as you just alluded to, Stephanie, imagery also impacts behavior. The majority of attackers, for instance, against Asians, we now know, are not people of color. And yet a disproportionate percentage of them that are portrayed in media are Black. What does that do to stoke anti-Blackness in the Asian community, intra-minority conflict, and so forth? There has to be an immediate impact from media in there. You also articulated, and Stephanie Morimoto articulated, the disproportionate challenges that face women, in particular Asian women. Women, as we all know from our diaspora, are grossly fetishized on media. Asian men are grossly emasculated. Our diaspora has been othered because of the use of accents that has been not always essential. And so a lot of this sort of not only perpetuates our lack of attractiveness, but also how we can be mistreated in the streets when it comes to attacks. We also talked about another example of monolithic power, especially for those of us with all of our resumes. We have something or a problem known as the model minority myth, which is the misperception that all of us are gainfully employed, educated, and wealthy. One of the sort of media pronunciations of this, which was a landmark, sort of essential historic moment, was Crazy Rich Asians. The problem, of course, with that film is we are not actually all crazy rich. even though we are all Asians. And perpetuation of mass market media like that perpetuates the sense that, or sorry, obfuscates, I should say, the notion that we actually have the widest income disparity. And it's not just about income disparity within our ethnicities, but as we know, within our sort of regional density and so forth. So just a lot of practical, again, challenges with imagery that impacts behavior. The final thing I'd say, because we are in the tech world, is, and I come from, of course, tech at Google, we used to have this misperception that content is grossly subscale, highly emotional, sort of not practical. But the reality is, according to Define American, that was founded by one of our members, Jose, 80% of traditional media exported worldwide comes from the United States still. And we can lament all day long why traditional media is old and not sort of the new digital and so forth. But the reality is, whatever we produce for 320 million people immediately impacts 8 million in some capacity. And so all the more why media, again, is not just essential in reasserting facts of lexicon and imagery, but really doing so at a global scale.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the steps that each of the people on this call have taken to really help improve participation and help improve outcomes. And Bing, I'm going to stick with you a little bit to have you talk about the A100 list. Why did Gold House start it, and what impact is it already having?
Sure thing. I should all begin by disclaiming, because I'm a nation from the South, that lists are, Stephanie, you also know this better than anyone. Lists are precarious. I think all smart people have a deep ambivalence to them. On the one side, they're really silly and sort of, vain. But the other side, they're also important because they're a distillation, in our case, of the diverse and integral impact that our community has delivered to society. And so the A100 list, colloquially known as the Time 100 for Asians, not to mix publishing houses here, is an essential component of our holistic, what we call cultural change strategy, which is how do we comprehensively change media to reshape public opinion about our diaspora. It begins, of course, with research. So we conduct extensive studies to evaluate the most pernicious and prominent impacts against our community. One of the most recent ones that we just released last week is the single largest impact study on API women in media. It not only includes sort of an evaluation of how API women see themselves being portrayed, but also practical tips to media companies, whether advertising firms or studios, on how they can rectify the great intersectional and nuanced identities of women, who of course are more than half of the population. The second step is, once we have that research and have those tips, we culturally consult every major studio, TV network, and platform on everything from casting to product placement to themes to authentic sort of tropes and so forth, not only to dismantle pernicious stereotypes, but also affirm new ones. Third is pipeline investment. So we have a slate of different accelerators with sort of a who's who of the music, the film, and fashion, and sort of contemporary art industries, just so we can, present sort of a new face and sort of a new set of careers for our diaspora. Fourth, as you know, our Je ne sais quoi is something known as Gold Open. Prior to us, there really wasn't a viable perceived market for APIs in film. We changed that overnight with a film known as Crazy Rich Asians, where we were a dominant marketing reason why it was the best performing film opening weekend. I know this sounds silly to Silicon Valley, where we all know the long tail is very real, however asymptotal. But the reality is, in Hollywood, opening weekend is everything. It's a direct indication of a film's continued investment in longevity. We are also dominant marketing reason why Parasite was the best performing film opening weekend, which is important not just commercially, but to assert that even if we don't speak English, we are still global, we are still worthy, and so forth. And then finally, again, is awards like the A100 list. Just to further punctuate, lists, again, are important because we can't just expect everyone to keep up with all the nuances of every one of our stories or every one of our creative projects constantly. We have to distill in the same way that the Oscars distills film, the Grammys distill music. We have to distill our community for the masses as well.
Yeah. And going back to what you said at the beginning, I mean, what has been so exciting for me to see in the A100 list is the care with which that list is curated, and to make sure that, going back to where Stephanie started, that the full rainbow of Asian American culture is represented in that list. So kudos on that. Another program that's really exciting to talk about, Paul, I want to have you share a little bit about the racial justice and DEI strategy at General Catalyst, which has goals that include increasing access to funding for diverse founders. What is some of the progress that has been made, and what have you done to diversify who has access to VC funding?
Yeah, first, I'm just happy we made the A100 list, GC. So thank you for that, Bing. They also have a really cool program, just to continue that thread, the Gold House Ventures program, which I'll give a shout out for as well. I don't know if we'll come back to that later, but they have a investing arm where if you have an AAPI founder company, they will quickly find a way to invest in that round. You know, not huge amounts of capital, but very quick decisions, and then bring that network that Bing talked about to bear for an early stage founder. So we've obviously done a few deals together, but it's been a great way to just get that platform that he's building into people that wouldn't have access otherwise, given their journeys. So at GC, you know, again, I think the team here has been, you know, both intentional around trying to drive awareness and education. If I think about two words to use, I think intentionality and education. Obviously, you know, this seminar, you know, what we did last year around the African American journey, has been effective in driving awareness. The other thing we've done is a survey. So our second survey will hopefully come out in January. That's what Molly in the room tell me. And so we're very happy because this survey is quite granular. So we break down, you know, those different ethnic, gender definitions, much more so than typical venture capital firms. And we really try to drive engagement. So we have 100+ of our companies respond to the survey. It's quite detailed. And so there's a lot of great data around that. I think, you know, quick preview, you know, the numbers are up across all categories. You know, is that because of intentionality? Is that just because of everyone kind of driving it? Maybe, perhaps. But we feel good about, again, the education of looking at these things, being very granular on definitions, East Asian, South Asian, different genders, different sexual orientation, and then really trying to understand, hey, where's the data and how can we make that go up and to the right. I think the other thing we have been doing a lot here is responsible innovation. So this is really the mantra at GC for how we can invest in growth and in good. Responsible innovation is really across 5 pillars. It's about accessibility to technology. As you build technology, it's around sustainability. It's around diversity and inclusion. It's around trust and safety. It's around the promotion of safe and harmonious society. That's really the pillars of it. RILabs.org is the nonprofit we've helped fund and launch and has seen some really nice traction. They had a great event a few weeks back for founders. And this whole effort is to give founders the tools to build responsibly, because you're so busy building product, so busy going to market, so busy fundraising. There's only so much time you have. But if you had some more tools, some more processes, from some more networks, some more best practices around how to build responsibly, that could make your life easier. So that's a whole effort we've been putting in place for the last really 2 years here. So, you know, those are some of the things, you know, again, education, awareness, events like this, and then tools and processes to help you really grow and build.
Yeah. And Paul, do you want to take a moment to shout out a few of the portfolio companies that you and Bing have co-invested in?
I can't pick on anyone. There's a bunch. It's probably like
you love all your children equally.
Half dozen,
yeah, thinking between children.
It's been great. We're definitely open for business on all fronts, and we love them all. But no, it's been amazing to kind of be much more intentional, to be frankly. I think, you know, a lot of this, everything we do here is around being intentional, and just having that in the back of your mind as you think about things has been really effective for us.
Yeah. Just to dig in on the responsible innovation piece a little bit more, Paul, you know, when you come to the founders in the portfolio companies with these tools, particularly the tools around diversity, equity, and inclusion, you know, what has the response been from the founder community? As you said, they're all so busy building product. Have they found that the tools are really helping them build a DE&I capacity or muscle at a much earlier stage than, you know, oftentimes startups are thinking about?
Yeah, I think it's definitely driven that, both from a mindset standpoint, you know, the intentionality, but also having tools and practical uses. So, you know, our talent team has been very focused on driving this from an actual, you know, team representation, board representation standpoint. From an investment standpoint, as we do deals, we look at it from a lens that's part of every criteria. How do we think about responsible innovation in that given company's context across those dimensions? And then kind of just overall, again, you know, throughout the firm. But again, it's not about, you know, GC per se. This is about how do you drive that intentionality into the venture capital industry, which is why it's in this outside entity called RI Labs and this nonprofit. How how do we catalyze the industry itself to just be much more thoughtful around these things and have those metrics? There's a whole OKR equivalent we talk about, kind of a key consequence indicator, KCI. It's kind of in our book as well, which we wrote called Intended Consequences. But how do you put in place metrics for these initiatives? They're not OKRs per se, they're kind of key consequence indicators to drive the business and measure your impact on diversity and hiring.
Yeah. Just a reminder to everybody who's tuning in, please drop your questions or comments in the chat. We would love to bring you into the conversation. Stephanie, as Molly mentioned in your intro, you have a long history of helping women entrepreneurs. Are there interesting lessons from the world of supporting women that we can import to the world of supporting AAPI founders? Are there things that you learned along the way that you think, folks like Bing and Paul and myself can apply to trying to help advance the cause of AAPI founders?
I think Bing and Paul touched on some of the key factors that have a really high impact, right? Obviously, access to capital is an ongoing challenge for both women entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color. Getting access as well to the management expertise around how do you build the right team, the right systems, how do you make sure you have the right product market fit? The thing that's actually been on my mind the most lately as an entrepreneur is putting yourself out there as the face of the brand. Obviously, we're talking a lot in this discussion about the power of representation and how there is limited representation for Asian Americans in general, let alone the full diversity of what who our community is, who we are in the world and what we represent. And I have to admit, I have to credit a Black woman entrepreneur for pushing me on this. I had a conversation with her and she said, when I put myself out there in a way that allowed people to feel like they were part of my community, they could be a part of my success as the owner of this business, that's when my brand really took off. And I do think more of us showing the fullness of who we are, right? The good stuff, the bad stuff, the amazing, the messy, is really important to advancing everything that we're talking about today. And I do think in today's world, people are craving connection. They're craving that sense of belonging. And if they feel like they can connect with you as the owner or the executive or the leader of a company and brand, and that you embrace values that resonate with them, they are going to buy the products and services. They're going to participate in that. And so I think actually Paul and Bing are so perfectly positioned to support AAPI entrepreneurs on this. Yes, how do you build a strong business? How do you build a strong team? How do you have the right capital? And how do we support you to put yourself out there in a way that's really helpful and positive?
Yeah. Stephanie, talk a little bit more about the thought process you went through, because I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that, when women put themselves out there, and it's a double-edged sword, right? First of all, I think more women entrepreneurs are expected to have that Instagram presence and to have that sort of, glossy life. And yet at the same time, females are definitely subject to more harassment. Women of color are especially subject to greater harassment online. So I just wonder how you navigated the process of putting yourself out there, as you said, and what are the things you do to try to protect yourself? Yeah,
I feel like we could spend an hour just on that topic probably, but I was honestly really torn. I have never lived my life in public in that way. I have been very committed to lifting up other women and providing that mentorship, but it's always been in a more, background one-on-one type of way. But that conversation with the Black woman entrepreneur I mentioned really did push me. She said, you've got incredible products, incredible customer testimonials, and an incredible personal story yourself, having suffered from burnout and not feeling like you belonged in a lot of places. And a lot of people feel that way. And it would be great for them to realize they're not alone. And that really struck me, because I think at least for me personally, and maybe this is helpful to others, the thing that's always motivated me is that sense of purpose. What is it that I can pull from my own experience and share with others that may help them in some way? Maybe it's something really tiny like, oh, I felt like that before. And it's really heartening to hear that somebody else who seems like they have it all together has felt lonely or has felt like a failure, who has felt like they don't belong. And maybe it's something much bigger, right? Oh, wow, I'd love to run my own business too, and here's a model. So I think that's what really pushed me to do it. For me, I personally also tire of like the super glossy curated lives that you see on social media. And it was also important to me to show me as real, right? Like I literally sit on the floor of my family room and record videos that provide affirmations for people. And I'm not wearing some fancy outfit. I'm on the carpet in my socks talking to people. And that has really resonated because I think people are also looking for that more, I hate to use it because I think it's overused, but authentic or real connection. And then what I found fascinating, because I was worried about the trolling too, is that because the content I'm putting out is more positive and about accepting yourself, we had a couple trolls early on. And what happened was the community of people that followed me actually kind of fought back with them, but in a respectful way. They said, hey, I think you're misinterpreting what's being said here, or actually, I think this is what we're trying to discuss. And that was so powerful because the trolling stopped right away. So I think if you can create the right community, that community actually protects you as the, as the influencer, because they want a safe space to engage with each other.
Yeah, so interesting. I'm fascinated by the fact that you and a female entrepreneur who happened to be Black had this really interesting conversation. And I want to talk a little bit about our role as AAPI allies for other communities of color. But before we do, Bing, I've got a question for you, and I'm struggling to articulate it, so bear with me. But I was struck by the fact that on the one hand, Crazy Rich Asians is this amazing example of the AAPI's community's ability to rally around a film, elevate it, create this amazing box office. But at the same time, it does perpetuate certain stereotypes that, taken out of context, could be negative to the broader community. And so I'm wondering how do we circle the square? How do we allow both things to be true at the same time?
I'm going to sound like my mother and invoke two dualities that are competing. I think one is, or rather two, are principles. The path to progress, as we all know, is deeply unpaved. We are trying to reverse, in our diaspora's case, millennia worth of misperceptions, and that's just not going to be a perfect sort of path. The second is, there's nothing in life that is a full panacea. There's no film that represents an entire diaspora, certainly not the richest race in the world. Richest is probably a poorly chosen adjective there, but the 50 ethnicities, are hundreds of dialects, our distribution density to every edge of the earth. There is going to be no single word, phrase, novel, film, TV show, platform that fully represents any of us, or all of us, I should say, excuse me. So I think that's first and foremost, that mind shift change of progress is unpaved and there's no panacea is where it begins. The second piece is, we get asked this often by every studio: how do we make sure that we're speaking to the rich API diaspora? I keep using rich. I'm clearly primacy is terrible. But anyway,
Multifaceted.
Yeah, multifaceted. There it is. But no, I think the second piece is also a duality. The more specific, the more universal, as Director Bong Joon-ho said when he won the Academy Award, the more specifically we can articulate the nuances of our community, far beyond, dare I say, race, gender, ethnicity, but going into faith, going into socioeconomic sort of brackets and so forth, the better off we are. Because the more sort of specific stories we'd be able to tell, are the more authentic stories, to invoke Stephanie's parlance, Stephanie Morimoto's parlance. The second piece is abundance. This is a place where having a buffet approach, more is more, is better. Having more stories or more opportunities, whether it's capital, whether it's C-suite executives at major media houses like Stephanie Mehta and so forth, is so critical. And that's the answer. The final piece, just to sober us, is unfortunately all the work in ESG is quite Sisyphean. We could have all the billions of dollars, all the eyeballs of all 8 billion people in the world, and the reality is we would still miss someone. And that is just the nature of the work of, we are always going to be at a loss, because humans are not stagnant species. We are constantly evolving, as are our experiences, and by virtue, of course, part of that is our identities. But again, as long as we are committed to being as specific and inclusive as possible, as long as we are consistently trying to progress, I think that's really all we can do.
Paul, I'd like to ask you a little bit about how your perspective as an Asian American investor has influenced the way that you nurture founders, think about the founders that you want to support, particularly founders from sort of underrepresented groups. And I'd love some examples of times where your identity and experience as an AAPI leader may be informed the way you approached a non-AAPI, but still underrepresented founder or entrepreneur.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Stephanie. I think if I look back, what I was lucky to have over my career was to work with people from different backgrounds and different, journeys, right? So I was able to work on, I did IPOs on all 6 continents of the world. There's 2 of them that are hard to do IPOs on, Australia and Africa. And I got to see companies, in different profiles and different archetypes. So I think that was helpful. But to say that, hey, I was an Asian American minority, that gives me more understanding of another minority. I think it's a really tricky conclusion to go down and to feel like that, because I don't know what it's like to be, a Black American, right? And so I think that, understanding and having deep appreciation for everyone's journey, I saw that firsthand. I've seen, all sorts of companies, all sorts of journeys be very successful. But I think what really is important is really education. I think that's where we take it for granted sometimes, and we don't ask the hard questions. And I'll give you one example. One of my most important clients, my Wall Street career, was African-American at one of the 3 biggest tech companies in the world. And I did a lot of business with this person for many years, big deals. And, one time we just talked about what was it like as a Black American? And he said, it's crazy. I have microaggressions every single day of my life. Again, this was one of the senior most executives at one of the 3 biggest tech companies in the world. And this was a conversation 10 years ago. And I had no idea, right? And he was like, his dad was a cop in Boston. And the only thing his dad told him was, if a cop ever pulls you over, get on the ground right away. And this was 10 years ago. So again, I never had that conversation with him, having been, really one of his best friends. And so I think understanding everyone's journey in preparation for today's conversation, I was talking to a Asian American VC just to get his thoughts, a younger generation VC. And his feedback was, last week he had an event he organized and he felt uncomfortable because at one point, during the dinner, there were about 12 people. They were all male. He was male too. They started talking about, skiing, and he never had that exposure, never gone skiing before, and felt uncomfortable and kind of like, hey, so you can go something as serious as, the first conversation to the second. So education and really understanding everyone's journey and what it means to be underrepresented is really, to me, the lesson I've taken from my career, whether, you're in different geography, different backgrounds. So I think one of the beautiful things about this time and this awareness and all the conversations we're having is we use this as a way to really understand each other in a more empathetic, deeper way. And that's going to be a beautiful thing if we can pull that off.
Yeah. Stephanie, I'm surprised that Molly didn't mention this in the intro, but your co-owner and chief brand officer is someone a few people may have heard of, Venus Williams. Something of a household name. What are your conversations with Venus Williams like, particularly when it comes to the conversation around allyship?
Yeah, well, I love everything that Paul and Bing were just saying about empathy and really understanding, like listening and trying to understand what it's like to walk in others' shoes. I think that's something all of us can do more of, especially in today's world, which feels ever more divisive. I think for Venus and me, we're both so committed to, to lifting up girls and women. So a lot of our conversations have really been at that intersection of race and gender. As many of you probably know, Venus has been a very staunch advocate for pay equity, especially for women in tennis, and was one of the people who helped, following in Billie Jean King's footsteps, to ensure that women get equal prize money in tennis tournaments as men do. And she's taken that fight to corporate America. So every year she does a campaign around the pay gap and fighting for greater pay equity across both gender and also racial lines. And I think that's also important as we think about Asian Americans. As Paul was saying early on, the journey looks different depending on your ethnic group as an Asian American. So I think, there's reports out there that show that some of the greatest income inequality is actually within the Asian American community. And then if you look at, say, Vietnamese women or Pakistani women, they're making 50 cents on the dollar or less as compared to white men. So that pay gap is real. And I think the last thing I'll just say, I mean, this is relevant for both my conversations with Venus, but I think also for our conversations with everybody, is we forget sometimes, I think, that in the height of the civil rights movement in the 60s, right, we were all fighting together for each other. Black Americans were fighting for rights for Asian immigrants and refugees coming to the United States as a result of war. We were fighting as Asian Americans for civil rights for the Black community. And so I think in addition to really having that empathy and listening to what it's like to be in other people's shoes, like using the privilege and power you do gain as a pop culture person, as a public office person, as an entrepreneur, to fight that fight for others as well.
While I have you, Stephanie, there was a question in the Q&A. Della Mosley asks, who was the Black woman entrepreneur that gave that great coaching advice to Stephanie Morimoto? Would love to look them up and support their work if it's okay to share.
Yes, please do. Her name is Monique Rodriguez, and she founded Mael Organics, which is a hair care company for people with textured curly hair. Her business has blown up. She started as a registered nurse who had her own hair issues and started formulating products to help with her hair growth. And she shared that journey, which is obviously a very vulnerable, especially as a woman, I would say, a very vulnerable journey to share online. And that's how she built her community and built her business. And now Monique and I actually serve on a board together in Chicago that's sending both kids and their parents to college debt-free. And she is massively giving back to the Chicago community.
It's amazing. Women helping women right here on the right here on our webinar. Bing, we haven't talked that much about AU Holdings, but as I understand it, you're looking to incubate and invest in multicultural creators. I'd be curious to get a sense from you about what multiculturalism sort of means to you, and how do you think that the different creators in your portfolio who are multicultural kind of learn from one another?
Sure thing. I think it comes from personal experience back at YouTube. But back when I was at YouTube, YouTube was effectively, dare I say, I'll get fired for saying this, trying to be HBO, license a bunch of premium, as it were, content, use that as a Trojan horse for originals, eventually own direct audience relationship and so forth. But I think what was more interesting is how do you actually create a platform where anyone can realize their creative ambitions and can sustain them commercially? And we realized that that bastion that became known as the creator economy was entirely driven by minorities who were just disproportionately or entirely omitted, I should say, in terms of representation from traditional media. The three demographics were, of course, the Asian diaspora, the African diaspora, and the LGBTQ community, where when you looked at the top 12 categories from the IAB, they were just dominating all of them. And so it just comes from this risk realization that people don't just deserve to be seen. This is also a commercially viable opportunity. And so AAPIs Holdings is my parent company across all of my different enterprises, and it stands on that belief that investing and incubating in content that reshapes beliefs and companies that reshape behaviors are the two essential components of socioeconomic equity, aka unlocking new platforms where we can all thrive. The closest analog I'd argue is the Walt Disney Company, where agnostic of their 5 to 6 different divisions, it's effectively a bifurcated structure. They have IP, as we all know, there are franchises in Marvel, Star Wars, as well as their studio networks, but ultimately those are trying to tell people how dreams can come true. And then second is they, of course, have their distribution paths, their direct services, Disney Plus, CPG, theme parks, resorts, to sort of further evangelize that and sustain behavior. And so when we think about multiculturalism, we also take a dual approach where sometimes we specifically focus on communities that are historically misrepresented or underrepresented. But then secondly, we also try to universally identify opportunities where they can cross-pollinate to grow a larger pie. I think about this in 3 capacities, to be very pedantic and annoying. One is cross-industry. As we all know, new industries are not just born from obscurity, they're typically hybridizations of traditionally disparate groups. Digital media is the best example of this. It's a nexus of technology, content, and advertising, of course. Second is cross-continental. I'm a third culture kid, or had the privilege, I should say, of being one, who grew up on both North America and Asia. And so I saw and lived firsthand what happens when concentric experiences align. and said even further how more similar we are than we are different. So I focus to that end. I'm mostly North America and Asia. And then third is cross community. As Stephanie mentioned, supporting other communities is not just about the cardinal law of you should give a damn about your neighbor. There is also, dare I say, commercial value. People forget it was Black leaders that really led the civil rights movement and unlocked practical opportunities for other minority groups, specifically the Asian Latino groups, for interracial marriage, improved immigration, voting, so forth and so on. And so I'm not trying to say that we should, just be tit for tat on this, but the reality is when we do good, we can also be great, I think, together. So anyway, so that's the premise of the holding company. So far, so good. We'll see.
So based on all of that, Bing, and I'm going to ask the same question of the other two panelists as we get close to wrapping up. And again, if folks have questions or comments, please do drop them in the Q&A or in the chat. Are you optimistic? What do you think the future of AAPI representation in tech and media will look like?
Ooh. This is the $1 trillion question, right? For 2 billion people, or for, excuse me, 4.5 billion people. I would say there's no sort of single right answer, but my approach to this is always affirmation as opposed to just affliction. And what that means is Goldhouse is now trying to build a Stop Asian Hate nonprofit for 22 million people. Goldhouse exists because we realize the power of our diaspora and therefore the responsibility to uplift all communities, particularly those who've been also marginalized, because as a minority, we have a responsibility for creating space. And so when I look at the richness of our diaspora, I've now used rich 3 times, but I see 4.5 billion people. I see a disproportionate majority of multinational growth, specifically from our motherland. I see the fastest growing immigrant population. I see an outconsumption of other groups. And I'm not trying to perpetuate sort of a toxic notion that we are worthy because we consume, but the reality is we do create and consume a lot of productive apparatuses. And so the question then becomes, how do we deploy those to others in sincere and sustainable ways? Just to give you 2 examples of how we think about this. One is the plight that women face daily, particularly API women, is of course the fault of men. And so it is incumbent on really men, not just women, to rectify these problems. Paul mentioned our Goldhouse Venture Fund, which we have such a privilege of partnering with GC and many other leading firms on. I can tell you that 52% of our founders since inception in our network have been women, aka 52% of the companies in our network have been led by women. This is because we know how math works. 51% of the world is women. We all know why that is not the case in venture, whether it's raising and or starting a company, though of course we have exceptional people here who've broken that rule in the best ways. But number one is we have a responsibility to sort of rectify that, whether it's through sort of inclusion on the number side or through specialized programs. A second way that we think about it is, as Stephanie Morimoto embodies within our own company, how do we ensure that we're locking arms sincerely, sustainably with our other sort of multicultural counterparts? So just another example of what we've done is we launched something recently called the Multicultural Leadership Coalition, where we partner up with several of the top multicultural led and focused funds, from Harlan Capital to Gangels to BBG, where we are already swapping board directors and advisors and have already placed 4 different board directors on privately held companies. This is important because, as we all know, diversity there is in low single digits for white women, which is great because, again, white women are 51% of the world, but not great because white is not. And so that's where I see this of, how do we focus on our power, but how do we, again, sincerely and sustainably deploy it for everyone's benefit?
Right. And Bing, just tell me again, what was the name of the program across the different venture funds that focus on multicultural and founders?
It's the Multicultural Leadership Coalition. It's the most syllabic name in the world and a horrendously terrible URL. So forgive me for that. It's also the least creative name we have across our entire enterprise, but that's okay.
I love a coalition. I love a coalition. Paul, same question for you, focused a little bit on the world of tech. What does the future of AAPI representation look like in tech, and what gives you a sense of optimism, if anything?
No, I think, listen, awareness, the data, the progression, the intentionality, I think all those things are great, and we're definitely making progress. And we can feel sanguine about that. I think just education and just understanding history. I think the more we celebrate the differences across all these communities, all these groups, you will find the commonality there to bring them all together. I think there's just, amazing amount of goodness that happens when you dig in, understand history, understand people, understand their journey. You will find the commonality because we're all human, and that'll bring a lot of these groups, a lot of these missions, a lot of these objectives together. The thing I was trying to tell my two daughters this story, and they kind of ignore me, so I'm just gonna tell it now because I feel like it's a big one. But obviously the reason why on my biography it says that at GC that my parents got to come to America in 1967, 68 because the US let us in. Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and Asians were allowed to come into this country, thanks to the Kennedys and the acts of 1965 and the Immigration Acts of 1965. We were allowed. People don't realize 100 years prior, almost to the date, there were 2,000 Chinese who built the Transcontinental Railroad that drove all of the economic growth connecting San Francisco and New York. And there's this unfortunate little fact where the Chinese were so recognized for the contributions in building Transcontinental Railroad that the president of the railroad invited the team to put in the final stake in the ground at Promontory, Utah. And then they all went off to some fancy lunch in his railroad car. When the photographer showed up to take the famous photo, the Chinese team was having lunch with the president. So there's no Chinese people in the photo, even though they actually drove the final stake into the ground. And so the famous photo, the famous drawings don't have the team there. And there was actually 1,500 who stayed and lived in Tahoe for a few years. So again, the more you dig into the history, the more you kind of learn more about each other, you find the commonality. And, I think that's going to create more optimism for us.
Yeah, it's a great story. Stephanie, what are your, what gives you hope? And what do you see particularly in the entrepreneurial space when it comes to the way that AAPI leaders can show up?
Yeah, I think we're just getting started, which is what gives me optimism. I think, I would say to everybody on this call, let's focus on three things. Bing's right, we do have spending power. Asutra's in Target, so we look at a lot of Target data. And when you look at the Asian American guest at Target, who are mostly women, she spends a lot compared to other groups, in particular on new items, innovative items, which means emerging brands, which means AAPI owned brands, women owned brands, Black owned brands, right? So we can vote with our dollars, and I do think that's important. Public facing, whether you're an entrepreneur running for public office or in pop culture, let's see more people who look like us, because we didn't get to do that growing up. And the next generation will have a totally different vision for what's possible. And then I think for those of us who gained it, using our privilege in responsible ways. I mean, we're 60% people of color at Asutra, we're women owned, women led, and that is intentional, because I had women who lifted me up and helped me early in my career and took the time to teach me about these histories that we're discussing. And I feel like it's truly both my responsibility, but also my honor to give honor to them and future generations.
Well, this has been an incredibly optimistic session. I feel like we really did end on a high note. I want to thank Paul, Stephanie, and Bing for your insightful comments and for really giving us both a look back as well as a look forward when it comes to the future of AAPI leaders and our population. I'm going to turn things back over to Arun, who's going to take us on out.
Thank you, Stephanie Mehta. Thank you for expertly guiding this conversation. It's been fascinating. Thank you, Paul, Bing, and Stephanie Morimoto for sharing your knowledge with us. This does wrap our Racial Justice Learning Series that's focused on the AAPI experience. It's been really wonderful learning from so many this year. We at GC are going to take a break and then next year begin planning for a series that's focused on the Hispanic Latinx experience. So we're very excited about that. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Arun. I lead our DEI work at GC. Thank you to the audience, for everyone who has come and given their time. Happy holidays and Happy New Year to everyone. We hope to see you again next year when we continue the series.